And now to this evening's discussion with Edward Said and Akeel Bilgrami. Dr. Bilgrami is the Johnsonian Professor of Philosophy here at Columbia and taught at University of Michigan before coming here, where he has been teaching since the mid-'80s. Dr. Bilgrami is the author of Belief and Meaning and has 2 more books coming out with Harvard University Press next year, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, and Politics and the Moral Psychology of Identity, which focuses in particular on Islamic identity. Dr. Said is University Professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia. He is the author of more than 20 books, including Orientalism, Covering Islam, and Culture and Imperialism. His most recent publications include The End of the Peace Process, Oslo and After, Reflections on Exile and Other Essays, Power, Politics, and Culture, and Parallels and Paradoxes, Explorations in Music and Society, which is co-authored with Daniel Baraban. Dr. Said's Freud and the Non-European will be published by Verso in April of 2003. We're very, very happy to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming. And now, Akeel Bilgrami and Edward Said.
Thank you, Jamie. It's really very nice to have the chance to talk about Salman Rushdie. Edward is a good friend of his. He's been a friend of his for a long time and has many common themes of interest. So it'll be a very good opportunity to smoke him out on some of them. I don't know Salman like Edward does, but it's hard for an Indian, or especially an Indian with a Muslim background, not to admire him greatly and really to think of him as sort of elderly member of one's own family with that kind of affection, though he might protest the elderly.
Yes, it would.
Edward, I thought we'd start with me asking you to sort of say something about the trajectory of his writing. I know you loved Midnight's Children when it first came out and have been reading his work avidly since then, especially his novels. So do you want to start by saying something?
Yeah, well, I will. I'd be happy to. I met Salman Rushdie at somebody's house in the early 80s, and I must have been about 1982. I hadn't at the time read Midnight's Children, which came out 2 years before, but I had it, which is an important first step, obviously. And I recall our exchange was about that. He had read Orientalism, but I hadn't read Midnight's Children, and I said that I would do so after we went home and so on. And I did, and I was mightily impressed with it because it struck me as the novel of a man with the gifts of genius, really. First of all, linguistic gifts of a terrifyingly fertile and almost Joycean sort, turning, the most humdrum things into fireworks, verbal and intellectual fireworks. He was also, a man who understood and was interested in dealing with the history of his own country from a perspective that I thought at the time was really quite unique. I really hadn't met anybody or read anybody quite like him. That is to say, he was an Indian who was very English at the same time. And I remember when we met, he talked about his having been a student at, was it Rugby? I mean, an English public school,
right,
yeah. And then he studied Oriental studies at Cambridge. Islam was his field then. He had been in London for several years during the time that he was writing Midnight's Children, which I said appeared in 1980, but he had worked as an actor. He had been a writer of advertising copy, which you can actually see in some of the passages in Midnight Children and some of the later novels. I mean, he's great at what might be called squibs or jingles, which turn up obviously in the Satanic Verses and other places, and was in his accent and manner, not the way he looked obviously, but in his accent and manner, was extremely English. At the same time that he was also unmistakably Indian. So it was a melange that fascinated me, and I had never really encountered it. And I thought that Midnight Children is the great sort of anti-epic epic of the birth of modern India after the independence of August 1947, with which the hero of the novel is associated. He's born on the night when the British cede India to the Indians. Was a work of the most extraordinary power and wit and insight, particularly in something we may come back to, in that the book is impregnated with British imperialism. I mean, even though it's the end of imperialism, the empire sort of lives on in so many ways, in characters and rituals and memories and buildings and occasions, and of course, above all, in this language, which, like Joyce, an outsider, Rushdie makes his own. Thereafter, I saw quite a bit of him, both in England and in America. He's always had a very great interest in popular culture, and particularly American popular culture. Right. But his subsequent books, Shame, which deals with the India-Pakistan War of the middle 60s.
Satanic Verses.
Later the Satanic Verses, yeah. But he also published in the middle 80s a book that was, I think, very, very interesting, a collection of essays, which came out just before the Fatwa, which was 1989. So this one must have come out 87, 88, called Imaginary Homelands, which gives a very interesting idea of his essayistic scope. I mean, he was very, very prolific in writing reviews and appreciations and polemics, right. Particularly about something we'll come back to probably, about British racism, multicultural Britain, and racism in it, and what he called, a phenomenon that he identified as Raj revivalism and the return to, in The Jewel and the Crown and the making of the film Gandhi and things of that sort, where you look back on empire with a certain kind of sentimental nostalgia almost. He was merciless in dealing with that, but he also dealt rather prophetically with the role of writers in politics. And his biggest essay in the book is called Outside the Whale, which is a kind of rejoinder to Orwell's essay, which begins with Henry Miller, called Inside the Whale. And the argument is there that there is no outside to the whale being society. That we're all involved, and there's no such thing as a non-political, uninvolved writer. But if you read those words now, they have a kind of eerie, quality to them, because in a couple of years he was going to be immersed in this terrible quandary. Right. And then, of course, the Satanic Verses appeared, and I recall very well that in the I wish my wife is Marion here. No. But Mariam and my wife and I spent July the 4th, I think it was 1987, yes, with Salman and his then second wife, an American novelist called Marianne Wiggins. Right. They had just bought, it was July the 4th, yes, the weekend, and they had just bought this new house in Islington. And, and Salman was very excited about July the 4th, and we had fireworks in the garden. Can you believe it? It was quite funny. But I remember with great clarity a moment that took place early on in our visit, where he took us on a tour of the house. And we went to his study, and there on his desk was sitting this gigantic manuscript, something like that. It was, in those days, it wasn't quite the period of computers. I think it was all typed. And he said, "This is my new novel." And I said, "Oh, really? What's it about?" He said, "It's about Islam." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Well," I said, "in a way, your other novels have been about Islam too." He said, "Oh, no, Edward, don't get me wrong. Direct quote, the Muslims are going to be very angry." I said, "Really? Why?" He said, "Because I talk about Gabriel, I talk about the Prophet Muhammad, and so on and so forth. And he said, it's a comic novel. I said, oh, well, that sounds fascinating. Could I read it? He said, of course. But it was so big, I couldn't carry it. So he said, I'll send it to you. And indeed, about a week later or 2 weeks later, when I came back to America, the book arrived at my doorstep. And I had, in fact, that very valuable thing, a manuscript copy of the Satanic Verses. And then we moved that very year, and from one house to another. And I threw it away. I mean, having read it.
No, but wait. You gave me a copy of it.
Of the manuscript?
I actually have it. So you just discarded it. I'll tell him. I'll tell him so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, I remember an occasion in your flat when you were here on Morningside Drive with Iqbal.
Yes.
And your mother was visiting from DC, and he was telling us. Salman was there, Carol was there, and he was telling us about what was in the Satanic Verses. Oh. And I think you had received it, but you hadn't read it. No. And Iqbal said, you know, they're going to kill you.
Right.
And
but he knew that it would make a lot of people angry, but I don't think he realized.
This is Iqbal Ahmed.
Iqbal Ahmed, who was a very dear friend of mine who died about 4 years ago, actually, and who met Salman through me. I mean, I don't think anybody expected. I don't know whether you read it shortly thereafter. And I mean, I looked through it. I must confess not to have read every single word of it at that time. I did later. And I was, aware, of what sort of dynamite was in the book.
Yeah.
But I had no idea of what was going to happen to the poor man.
But just getting back to Midnight's Children, it had a tremendous impact on Indian writers. I mean, suddenly, all sorts of people began to write novels in that vein, and with politics being very central to the writing and to the themes. In fact, a friend of mine, Mukul Keshavan, who's a novelist too and a scholar of Islamic history, presented Rushdie with his first novel, saying, with an inscription saying, "Thanks for the 4-minute mile." Because really it was as if he broke a barrier, and then everybody started just sort of doing much the same thing and the different things, sort of riffs on it and so on. And did it have an impact on writers in the Middle East?
No, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I think it brought home to many of them the sort of combination of magic realism and nationalism that was quite unique to the novel, and that some of the writers, the Lebanese novelist Ilyas Khouri, to whom I introduced Salman, or the other way around, I introduced him to Salman, has always found him a very interesting novelist for that reason. That is to say, it's a new way of dealing with nationalism in a way, kind of irreverent, and yet mythic at the same time. With tremendous sort of verve and above all, something we must insist on, with a tremendous comic sense.
Yes.
I mean, for example, that great scene where the doctor examines the mother of the hero through that hole in the sheet, and all the business about hiding under the doorstep, under the floor, which was actually a recollection of Ahmed Faz, as he told me later. Had a great and tonic effect on especially young writers, and especially those who are like Salman, who are expatriates.
Right.
You couldn't say that he was, at that time at any rate, an exile. I mean, he chose to live in England.
Sure.
And he had one other point which I've found out early on, but I never read it. He wrote a novel before Midnight's Children, which is called Grimus. Which is a sort of an English novel and has nothing to do with India. I think the appearance of Midnight's Children produced a whole library of sort of Anglo-Indian books. I mean, a whole like Buran Minstry and Arundhati Roy and others who may have not liked him or tried to imitate him, but he certainly opened the way for really a new mode of writing. And also, the last point, certainly a new well, not a new, but I mean a kind of jealousy. I mean, he became the person whom everybody either tried to emulate or kill, or, I mean, I don't mean, you know, actually kill, although that alas happened. I think that's Marion. Yeah, come. But you know, he became the figure that you had to measure yourself against for young writers. And resentments, you know, from writers who were not as well known as he,
Right.
who had been around for a while, etc.
Right, right. So, a governing theme of Midnight's Children is the sort of legacy of colonial rule in India, and it's a lifelong theme of yours. Do you think that Rushdie gets a lot right in Midnight's Children? That, I mean, apart from the brilliance of the writing and so on, is there a sort of perceptiveness about post-colonial, I mean, not India necessarily, but the sort of ethos, the cultural ethos?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I'm sort of embarrassed to talk about India's past as reflected, the colonial past as reflected in something like Midnight's Children in the presence of yourself and Nick Dirks and others who know much more about it than I do. But what I thought was really quite unique and ingenious about Rushdie's work was the sense that he gave you of the two histories, that of pre and post-colonial India, as really overlapping. I mean, that they couldn't be thought of as just two separate things,
right.
but that one continues in the other, and then the other, the newer history of, you know, post-47 India,
Right.
constantly is involved with and looks back to the past, and that invents its own past. I mean, so that modern India invents an identity for itself that is based on British India.
Right.
I don't think he's particularly kind to imperialism. I mean, certainly not in his essays and other things that he writes at the same time. But there is a sense in which imperialism is part of Indian history and can't be thought of as, you know, as a thing that ended in. I mean, that I think is the point of the novel in a way, that although things began anew on August, whatever it is, 1947. You can't say that everything just stopped and a new world began. And I think that's the major theme, really, of the kind of post-colonial world as I see it, and I think Midnight's Children reflects as well.
Yeah, you know, I've always found Midnight's Children to be a book, actually, which is very, very saddening and pessimistic in a way. And really sort of, one is distracted from that kind of response only by the brilliance of its writing and what you described as the sort of unstoppable comic element from beginning to end. And the reason for that, and this is something that I wanted to ask you really because it's so much the trajectory of colonized peoples and of people like yours who are still colonized but who one expects and hopes will cease to be soon, that they begin their lives at midnight on independence with such great hopes. And they have futures in their minds, really, as you know, the protagonists of Midnight's Children, the children. And those futures which are in their minds never become, I mean, they become pasts before they were ever in the present. You know, it's by the end of the novel. And so I think it seems very much the experience of people of the ex-colonies, that independence came with such hopes, and nothing seems to have been redeemed in history.
Yeah, no, I think it's the case with his generation, which is a younger one than mine.
Right.
I mean, there are references in the novel, as I recall, not having read it in years, but I mean, there are references to modern post-independence history. For example, the Bandung period. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is referred to. But that's all, you know, in a sense, part of history, and, you know, the disappointments and the and the absence of the kind of enthusiasm that was associated with the early period with Nehru and so on
Right.
is over. I mean, this is the period of Indira Gandhi, and I think it's a different post-colonial
Right.
period, one without much sentimentality for the past.
Right.
It's not heroic. Salman's novels, on the whole, generally tend to be anti-heroic.
Right.
And there is a certain, I wouldn't call it bitterness, but there's a certain critical edge to it. Well, certainly you see it in Shame. I mean, about the contemporary institutions, the military, the kind of posturing of nationalist leaders who have, in a certain sense, stayed on too long. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it quite pessimistic the way you do, but I think the flush of enthusiasm, I mean, that's what the novel is about. It's about growing older and shedding illusions about,
Right.
the great new dawn of independence that, the character is born into on the first page. Because there's also that famous, exchange of babies that takes
Yes,
place.
right.
So that from its very start, history is displaced. And must be, in a certain sense, a kind of mock history rather than an epic
Right.
history.
Right.
In that sense, I think it's very cleverly done.
Yeah, and by the time he comes to Shame, by the time he writes Shame, there's hardly an appealing character in the whole novel. It's
Yes.
just sort of, and really it's about the tremendous corruption among power elites, especially the leaders. And you must have, in the context of being colonized. And when I read your criticisms of some Palestinian leaders and so on, it seems so very deep-seated and Shame is a corrosive sort of look at that.
Yes.
And that must ring very true for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are, Shame in particular is a novel really about sort of you'll catch the reference. It's about staying on too long. I mean,
Yes.
people who have stayed in power too long and who have corrupted the contemporary society with their how shall I call it, with their obsessions and with their petty concerns, and above all with militarism. I mean, there's a lot of that. Also in my own history, I mean, and in the history of modern Pakistan, I mean, the numbers of coups, the emergence of a kind of core, sort of cabal almost, which he's very good about that, within governments. But I think the difference between Midnight Children and Shame is that I think Shame is a much more sober novel for me.
Yes, sure.
And therefore less interesting, less enjoyable. I mean, it doesn't have the reach and the tremendous energies of Midnight's Children, which is also, I mean, I suppose it's apt for this soon to take place opening of the theater. It was very theatrical in many ways, and reflects its own experience in the theater. And has a lot of mimicry in it and so on. And it's very much, but one important point, if I might just, one of the interesting themes in his career during the 80s, that is to say before the fatwa, 1989, was a kind of, I wouldn't call it rivalry, but there was a quiet attempt to distance himself from the other major Indian writer writing in English, namely V.S. Naipaul. I mean, there's a sense, in which there's a great competition between, although Rushdie is much younger than Naipaul, but Naipaul was the man who represented not only the business about, writing about the third world, which of course Rushdie does too, but also about the disillusionment, which is one of Salman's themes as well.
Yes,
but Naipaul, there was disillusionment and a kind of bitterness, and a kind of, especially in his books about travels in the Islamic world, like Among the Believers, which Salman wrote a review of, and it appears in Imaginary Homelands. That is to say, he doesn't take the same tone. There's still a great deal of affection and compassion in Rushdie's view that isn't to be found in Naipaul.
Right.
And I think what's also interesting, I mean, this is really, I shouldn't say this, but I remember once or twice, actually once here on the corner of 116th and Broadway, saying that, it was kind of strange that in Naipaul's writings, Naipaul having written much more nonfiction than he wrote fiction, lots of essays on books and obviously travel and so on, he never once mentions Rushdie at all. He paid no attention to him, deliberately. I mean, you can't not pay attention to Rushdie during the 80s, but Naipaul did. And the bitterness, he did not pay attention. And the bitterness and the kind of thing, and the kind of attack on the myths about colonialism by the formerly colonized was a subject that Rushdie dealt with in an entirely different, much more, as I say, compassionate and much more humane way than Naipaul, who was always eager to deflate the past and say, not that colonialism lasted too long, it didn't last long enough. I mean, look what happened after the white man left was his theme. You know, they all, and particularly in Naipaul's work, the kind of bitterness in the post-independence world, which you don't, I don't think, although he treats it in shame. I mean, if you look at a novel like A Bend in the River of Naipaul, you know, the kind of, you know, how Conrad's Africa after Lumumba and in the independence period, say, characterized by Chombe and some of the others, is really worse than under King Leopold. You don't get that sense in Rushdie, where the past is looked at, you know, with criticism, you know, the imperial past looked at with criticism, but not with a kind of, you know, acceptance and, you know, wish they had stayed a bit longer and we should have them back, etc. He makes fun of that theme, actually.
Right, and part of that, I think, is because in Naipaul's case, there's a very sort of deliberate and cultivated ignorance, right? I mean, about things like real history, I mean, real historical knowledge of the places he's writing about, political economies of the places he's writing about. I mean, it's a very deliberate attempt to say, I'm going to observe the surface culture and give an incisive, which he does, sort of set of observations and critique of it. Whereas somebody like Rushdie actually, for instance, in the Satanic Verses, he really studied Islamic history and it's the early period of Islam. That's why he goes for the jugular, really, because he understands it very well and has a sympathy for the possible progressive turn there might be in Islam and so on. And the sympathies he has for a socialist India, India where the nationalism is subdued by a kind of multicultural set of sympathies and so on. Those are things that emerge because he sort of understands the recent history. He knows his Bandung, as you say. He knows the leaders and what they stood for, where they came from, and all that is, whether he knows it or not, it seems almost as if he's deliberately shut it out in the case of Naipaul, in order to...
Well, not only shut it out, but I mean, he really writes out of a deep antipathy to Islam. I mean, the second book, I can't remember the name of it, Among the Believers was the first one, where he goes to Malaysia, Pakistan, Iran, and I think Pakistan, and writes these sort of devastating portraits of society, superficial portraits of Iran after the Islamic Revolution and so on. And then 10 years later, he writes the same book. He goes back to the same place. I can't remember the name of that book. But there's a kind of visceral dislike of Islam, which you don't get in Rushdie's book because he writes from the interior. I mean, for him, you know, Islam and Hinduism and, you know, the religions of India, you know, a pluri-religious society are very much what he wants. Whereas in the case of Naipaul, he regrets the mongrelization of the world, which is Salman's world and subject, in fact. That the world is made up of these hyphenated people, you know, and he celebrates them, and there's a great energy in the writing he does. And he's very interested also, I mean, one has to also say that one of the books he wrote in the 80s, also before the Satanic Verses, was a book called The Jaguar Smile, which I reviewed, actually, which is a book about his voyage to Nicaragua. It's important to remember all these things because Salman's political views have changed over time.
We'll come to that.
We'll come to that. No, but I mean, he went, and he was a visitor to the Sandinistas. You know, he was taken around and wrote very sympathetically about them and about Nicaragua as it was being attacked and subverted by the United States. You know, and it was a quite courageous book to do. And you know, it didn't get a tremendous number of sales, but I think it made an important contribution to the struggle against empire. I mean, the new empire, of which he was very much an opponent in those days. Yeah.
Right. You know, I was thinking when you talked about Islam in that sort of mongrel sense, it's interesting that for an Indian Muslim, you know, Islam came to India via Persia and Turkey and Central Asia, and sort of kept acquiring sort of local accretions in that journey. And so it became a very much more local phenomenon, you know, syncretic, continuous with Hindu culture and life. And yet there was also a sort of double movement, because there was this sort of deferential gaze to Arab lands and the sort of normative and scriptural elements, you know, the transcendental elements of the religion, you know, was another side of it. And there's this sort of interesting double movement in Indian Islam, and really the links between Midnight's Children and Satanic Verses is to actually play those two against each other.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Right.
I mean, and not only that, but I mean, they're outright, how shall I say, forecastings of things in the Satanic Verses in Midnight Children. For example, the father of the hero, Sinai, the father wants to be left alone in his later years. Why? Because he wants to rearrange the Quran, which he says is a very badly sort of put together book. And his idea is to retire quietly to rearrange the book in such a way as to give it a new kind of order. Right. Well, that's a theme, you know, that comes back in the Satanic Verses. Yeah. And the whole idea also of inventing traditions is very much the way he treats Islam, I think, in Midnight's Children, as something that people constantly talk about and revise, because precisely it's not. I mean, this is something that Naipaul attacked, whereas Rushdie, you know, has great affection for it. It's not, in a sense, our native religion. Therefore, we have to give it a native face, a native version here in India, and it's much more playful. I mean, so there's even in those early books, there's a sense in which Islam is not a severe ascetic, kind of unpleasant, sort of puritanical, fundamentalist thing, but rather, you know, it blends quite well with some of the, you know, some of the aspects of Hinduism, for example, that you know, Muslims would ordinarily not be congenial, feel congenial about, but in this case are really quite attractive, you know, because and Islam is seen through that prism rather than through that of 7th century Mecca, which he parodies, of course, in the Islamic verse. I mean, in the Satanic Verses.
And yet now, when he writes about Islam, there's the constant. I mean, you know, now talking about Rushdie Mark II, there's this constant sense you have with him that it's become a fundamentalist religion in many parts of the world, and
he's right.
And it's foolish in a way.
Well, but it's also right, yeah.
And that it's foolish in a way to say things like, well, people turn to it because of genuine grievances and so on. He's much keener to say its name really is tyranny. This is just fooling ourselves. We must fight it, even if with a war, if necessary.
Right. Could I just take a little time to go over that?
Sure.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying in general, but because, you know, I have followed his career quite closely and at times, you know, saw quite a bit of him and was involved in a very, very peripheral way in the struggle about the Satanic Verses. It's actually, it's a very painful story, his relationship with Islam. Because we mustn't forget, for example, that in the early 90s, it must have been a year or two after the fatwa, he wrote an essay which appeared in the New York Times, and which is the concluding essay in this wonderful collection of his that I refer to called Imaginary Homelands. It's entitled Why I Have Become a Muslim, and where he converted back to Islam. I think, to be honest with you, that I don't know anybody who wouldn't have had a tremendous sense of disorientation.
Sure, he was under no ordinary
tremendous,
duress.
I mean, after the onslaught against his book when it appeared in '89.
Sure.
And he went through a tremendous number of phases, obviously, of confusion, of resistance, of wanting to be, welcomed back in, to be accepted, then of denial and anger. I never forget the year he came here when I invited him. He came twice, I think, but the last time he came, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, I think you were here, we had a conversation
right.
at the Miller Theatre. The first question I asked him was, of course, after he was able now to travel and whatnot, 99, I think it was. And I said to him, Salman, how do you feel about being a member of the Islamic Ummah, the community? And he said, I don't feel I'm a member of it at all. It's something, I hate it. It's, and for him, Islam was Iran at that point.
Right.
But if you look back to his other writing, earlier writing than that particular moment, it was a much more modulated view. There was a sense in which Islam was a complex and interesting religion which had many parts to it, Indian and Persian and whatnot, that there was a British Islam. But then the whole thing fell on his head with the fatwa. And, we communicated in those first few months and even years when he was in hiding most of the time. You couldn't reach him except through, let's say, a third and sometimes a fourth person. And I recall, as a matter of fact, I think it was in 1990. Marianne, was it 1990 that we saw? Yeah. Anyway, she's not here. Oh, there you are. Was it 1990 that we saw him? Yes, in London. He was in hiding at the time. And he was surrounded by these policemen in Scotland Yard, and you had to make the arrangements the day before, and they come. We were staying in the house of a friend who wasn't there, so they'd given us the house. And so the Scotland Yard people come the day before, and then they come an hour before the appointed time, and then one of them comes in, and then he comes in and in disguise or wearing something, and the policemen were always in the house. They were on the second floor in this case. And, he looked terribly unhealthy. He was always indoors. He got fat. His skin was pasty and yellow. He looked awful. And he was a man who was suffering. And as I think, I'm just now trying to flesh out what it must have been like, the sense that, that his own people and religion had turned against him because, here they were, the English Pakistanis, the English Muslims, were the most vehement in a way. Bradford, where they burnt his book, and he was the subject of sermons, and then all through the world, the Islamic world, he was, so that I think it's what I'm trying to say really is it's almost impossible to handle. I don't think anybody could have done it any better, really.
Yeah, and the lesson is that persecution doesn't make people say sensible things very often. Yeah. But Edward, here's my thought, and I'd really like to know how. Let's explore this for a moment. You see, it's absolutely right. There's no gainsaying the fact that there are fundamentalist elements in Islam all over, around us here and in the Middle East, in South Asia, and so on, in Bradford. But I think it's sort of ubiquitously true, nevertheless, that most Muslims are not like that.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you.
So now, so here is a question. If most people are not like that, it's still nevertheless true that for reasons that you've written about at length and in depth, they nevertheless find it very hard to openly and strongly criticize the fundamentalists in their midst. Even though they are not fundamentalists, they oppose the fundamentalists, they can't easily come out and say so, not necessarily out of fear of the fundamentalists, because to do so would be in their own perception of things, to capitulate to a whole colonial history of subjugation, of continuing subjugation in Muslim lands, not in the guise of standard forms of colonialism, but new forms of and to come out and openly be critical is, in a sense, a bind for them, because it would be as if one is just sort of capitulating to that history and to its present manifestations. Right? So one of the pressing questions for somebody who's so deeply interested in Islam as as Rushdie is how should we give these people who are not fundamentalists, who are basically either indifferent to fundamentalism or opposed to it, the confidence, right, to say this is not Islam, we don't have to do this, and so on. How should they have the confidence to be able to do that?
Well, I think
it certainly won't. They won't get the confidence if one takes the kinds of stances that Salman has now started taking.
Yeah, I think.
And right,
I see your point. I see your point. I think because he's been so embattled, and because in a way he was trying to, to save his own life. You know, who can blame him for that? He wasn't perhaps as aware as he could have been of the many people in the Muslim world who defended him, and in fact really spoke out. I'll give you an example. It must have been in the early 90s. He was still, underground. A Moroccan woman in Paris and another woman, I can't remember who she was exactly, but there were two women, decided that they would put together a book which was called in French Pour Rushdie, for Rushdie,
right,
in which they would get 100 testimonials to Rushdie from the Islamic world, from prominent writers, from Turkey, from West Africa, from India, from the Arab world, all over the Arab world, and put it together as a book to show that the Islamic world was not made up essentially of fundamentalists and raving fanatics and ayatollahs and this sort of thing. And the book appeared. I contributed to it. And the book appeared, and it was then published in English by George Baziller. I think it may have sold 5 copies. I think it's very significant that this was a book that really was, freighted with an enormous amount of significance for the people who took this position, which is a very unpopular, as you say, position. Yeah. And in a sense made Rushdie's cause their cause as a way of fighting battles in their own countries, in their own societies. First of all, it immediately established the fact that Islam is not monolithic. That it isn't just one vast bodies of people, wearing turbans and waving scimitars and saying "kill the infidel," that kind of thing, and that there were different Islams, and there were different situations in each of the cultures of Islam, in each of the countries of Islam, and that there were many people of whom this was a symbolic 100, who were willing to stand up for freedom of expression and the freedom of the writer, and using aesthetics as a means of expression against fanaticism and dogmatism and authority. Well, that hasn't been recognized. I'm not sure that he recognized it either. Well, why should he? But I'm just saying there are things like that, and there has always been, unlike the sort of diatribes of people like Huntington, who have tended to talk about the clash of civilizations and the clash of cultures. There have been lots of people who have crossed from one realm to the other, including our friend Iqbal himself, who is a Muslim. And myself, I'm not a Muslim. I grew up in a Muslim world, surroundings. But I consider it my culture, even though I happen to have been born in a Christian milieu, but in an Islamic culture where the language, the lingua franca is Arabic. And so one can live in a world like that, and of course one also has to make the point, which he tried to, I think, in The Moor's Last Sigh, in the Andalusian novel that comes right after the Satanic Verses, that the culture of Islam, particularly if you look at it in Spain in the 13th and 14th century, was a pluricultural one. That Islam was much more tolerant than Europe. I happen to be reading now a book by the Israeli writer Amos Elon about the fate of the Jews in Germany. I can't remember the title. It just came out a few months ago. And I know Elon. He's an Israeli who's very, very critical of the Israeli government and is very depressed about the current situation. In any case, in the early part of the book, he talks about the strictures against Jews in Europe, until the French Revolution, basically. And there is simply nothing like that in the history of Islamic of the Islamic world, where Jews, of course, constituted a fairly important minority in places like Iraq and Yemen and so on, where Jews were not allowed were not allowed to wear shoes in cities like Frankfurt, for example. Were not allowed into the main part of the city without a Christian who accompanied. I mean, the most barbaric persecution and invidious sort of discrimination against them. You know, by the great Enlightenment countries of Europe, Germany and France and so on and so forth. Well, I mean, I think some awareness of that is very important, I think.
With the contrast with Andalusia, and indeed the contrast with the millet system under the Ottomans.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Which was...
but I think what has now happened in the world after 9/11 is that there has been, you know, a kind of polarizing struggle between the whole Islamic world, misrepresented by, you know, Osama bin Laden, et cetera, and, you know, the world as represented by George Bush. And I think I mean, both are equally, in my opinion, are equally false, you know, and therefore can't be taken as symbols of...
Yeah, but now I want to talk about you, and I mean...
Wait a minute, is that what we agreed that we were going to do?
No, you know, in these last words, you've been distancing yourself from some of his positions on recent political developments, and I just want to ask you, since you don't take that view, and I don't, and many people here I'm sure don't.
In fact, does anybody know anybody here who is for the war at this moment? I don't know. I haven't met a single person who is, but anyway, that's another subject. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Good. So will you please preach to the converted for the next time? Well, how should we sort of live and think with hope now if we don't?
Well, I think the main hope derives from the fact that there are a lot of people who are prepared to speak out against massive wars, at the same time that they are very critical of terrorism in the name or violence in the name of religion, but who understand, I think, at the same time that that we have to live. I think the way the Europeans have come to terms with it, partly because there are so many Muslims in Europe today. I mean, the second largest religion in France today is Muslim. So and in Germany has a huge number of Muslims, Turks and Kurds and Arabs and so on who live there. That Islam has become not some outside force as it has become for Americans, understandably because of 9/11, this horrible sight of these planes crashing into the World Trade Center and causing such havoc and such senseless suffering.
Yeah, but even in Europe, right, the formal apparatus of democracy is completely divorced.
No,
from the
but I mean, that's what I was coming to. In other words, there's a sense in some parts of Europe, leaving aside England for a moment, and in parts of Europe where there's a sense that the future has to be based upon a sense, you might say, of international community, of a kind of of an integrated world in some way, which fosters coexistence and an exchange between cultures that may not like or accept each other, but who have to live in this small planet in a sustainable and humane way. I don't think that's the case here, alas. I mean, in this country,
or in Italy, or England,
Well, I mean, those governments. I mean, England it's quite dramatic. There's a major failure of democracy in some of the Western democracies, including ours. I mean, I don't care what the polls say and how the questions are asked, but there is a major feeling of unrest in this country about the mobilization of war, which has nothing to do with, in the end, being for Saddam Hussein. Nobody's for Saddam. He's a horror, and etc. The same in England, when 85% of the population is against the war. In Italy, something like 90%. In Spain, 94% are against the government's position. But what I'm talking about is how a relatively small cabal of people, for their own purposes,
that's right.
I mean, have really mounted the barricades and are leading a ruinous crusade to destroy and redo the world in the Middle East for reasons that have nothing to do with democracy, that have to do with the preservation of access to cheap oil, the preservation of Israel, and very much at the core of this, which isn't mentioned today at all in the media talking about the Middle East. People like Perle and Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and all these other people were advisors to Netanyahu in his prime ministerial campaign in 1996, in which they advocated the annexation of the West Bank, the end of the peace process, to stop Oslo, whatever it was doing, and to attack Iraq. And now this has become the official, 7 years later, it's become the official policy of the US government. It doesn't represent the policy of the vast majority of people in this country who are ill-informed by the media and so on. And you have this sense in which the world of Islam, as I don't know who calls it that, but I mean somebody's, is this sort of, this ridiculously demonized thing.
With nuclear weapons.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you know, we have to fight against it with more. Now, unfortunately, in this battle in the last few months, Salman has, to me, inexplicably turned up on the side advocating war. I mean, I'll never forget it. I mean, it's not so long ago. I don't want to make it sound as if it was, 40 years ago. It was about 2 months ago. I pick up a copy of The Guardian. I was in England, it was. I'll tell you exactly. It was about the 24th or 25th of January, and there was an article in The Guardian and saying, "Who are the British hawks?" And there was, of course, Tony Blair at the top of the list. Pictures of each of these people. And Michael Howard and Willie Shawcross and and Christopher Hitchens. And there, under Christopher Hitchens, or maybe above him, was a little picture of Salman Rushdie, also an advocate of the war against Saddam Hussein. Well, for all the right reasons. I mean, Saddam Hussein is a terrible dictator. He's done horrible things to his people. He's threatening the world, etc. Well, I could say the same things about Sharon, for God's sake.
Or Bush.
Or Bush, or I mean, or a lot of people. But does that mean that I want to go to war? That's what surprises me. I mean, that there's a turn there for which I don't find really evidence in his work at all.
Right.
For that kind of.
And the amazing thing is that we don't even know how to theorize about the fact that these people nevertheless get re-elected, and so the formal elements of democracy don't seem to have much to do with the demos, which what they're supposed to be for. And I don't think liberal democratic political theory has an account of this, that this can happen repeatedly as it does in this country. And I think we're pledged to raise to allow the audience to ask you questions. I know that you've been very keen on actually talking about his other novels, The World of Rock and Roll and...
No, that I can't talk about, because I know nothing about rock and roll.
But what about...
Fury?
Well, what about Love and Money and Sex in New York? I know you want to talk about that. All right, so we'll open the discussion to questions from the floor. I will moderate this, and I will urge you not to get up and make a speech, but to put a pointed and brief question. All right? Questions?
Now's your chance.
Yes.
Could you say something about either your views or Rushdie's views about how Kashmir ought to be handled going forward?
No, I can't, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about what his views on Kashmir are. And you should talk about it.
I'll say just a word. I mean, the question should really be directed to Edward, but I guess my own view on this is that the U.S. has put a fair amount of pressure on Pakistan to curtail its support of militant Islamic groups in Kashmir with some success, but it has put absolutely no pressure on India to come to the negotiating table and come to a political solution on this. This is just an utterly inexplicable and unjustified asymmetrical approach. And that is because they are in the present climate, India is an ally, and India is a country in which over 2,000 Muslims were killed in the matter of 10 days, and the US government didn't say a word about it. So it doesn't look very optimistic sitting in this country. Yes?
Could you please elaborate on Richard Perle when he advised Netanyahu in 1996 about the new policies?
Well, that's basically it. I mean, he was part of a group that was put together to help Netanyahu gain the prime minister's position during the election campaign of 1996, during the period when the Oslo process had been supported, of course, by the Clinton administration, had been, from one point of view, going forward. From the Palestinian point of view, it was a rather more complicated situation because there were very few concrete changes on the ground, and in fact, the immiseration of the Palestinian population under Oslo had really quite seriously taken hold. This 96 was the year of the closures, the beginning of the closures, by the Labour government of Perez at the time. And the amount of land conceded to the Palestinians in the peace process had gone up to about maybe 12% of the West Bank and about 60% of Gaza, which was never desirable by the Israelis at that time. There was a strong feeling in this country, represented by people like Norman Podhoretz, I mean the people on the extreme right and the neoconservatives in this country, that there should be no concessions to the Palestinians at all, and that the whole peace process and the whole emphasis of the Clinton administration on trying to settle the problem between the Palestinians and Israel was a mistake. That what Israel should do would be to, just as I said earlier, to annex the West Bank and Gaza, to stop the discussions between themselves and the Palestinians, and to take a hard line on the general situation in the Middle East, in effect aggravating the tension between Israel and its Arab and Muslim neighbors, in which, for example, Lebanon was thought of as, a place that should be retained. The Israeli occupation of South Lebanon was then in its 18th year. And they were losing a lot of troops at the time, but the position of the Likud at the time was that this should continue. And so the question was either to press forward with negotiation or to take a very hard position inside Israel and recommend that Israel basically continue the settlement policy, that it should be increased, which it was. And that one of the ways of relieving pressure on Israel was to turn. Perle is absolutely right about this, really, that potentially the greatest enemy for Israel in the Arab world was not the Palestinians from a military point of view, but Iraq, because Iraq was the only country in the Middle East that was not overpopulated, that had immense resources, both oil, probably greater oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. Now it's described as the second largest proven oil reserves. But it also had water, the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which was unusual in the Middle East. Well, if you look at the other oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, of course, they're arid. Most of them are just arid desert. And desalinization is a major project. It's very costly, and its results are not very good because, the land is not fertile. And so in this memorandum that these people wrote for Netanyahu, which is available on the internet, you can get it, they recommended all these things, including attacking Iraq, which you remember Israel had done already in the early summer of 1981 when they attacked the Osirak reactor, nuclear reactor, which was supplied to the Iraqis by France. So you can see the seeds of what's been happening now already back then, and the position of this sort of hard right group, which included, as I say, Wolfowitz. It included Rumsfeld. Many of the protagonists, some of major figures in the current Bush administration, was pressing Israel to take positions that are very similar to the positions the United States has now taken in the Middle East. It stopped the peace process. It has let Sharon do what he wants in the last 2 years since the Second Intifada began. Thousands of Palestinians have been injured, 40, 50,000 major injuries of Palestinians. Many, many, many have been killed, 4 or 5 times more Palestinians than Israelis have been killed. And of course the settlements have continued, and this is US policy. I mean, when in June of last year, Bush got up and said that Sharon is a man of peace, or was it April? I can't remember. The world, I'm sure including Sharon. We're surprised. And these are the people whose policies now are guiding U.S. politics and military moves in the Middle East. Because I think the idea is to put Iraq out of commission, not because it's a threat to the United States. Obviously it's not, but it's a potential threat to Israel, which, according to this policy, must retain, unquestioned dominance, military dominance over the whole Middle East. And he's right in another thing, that the new axis of power in the Middle East would include Turkey, which has performed very well, in my opinion now, by not going along. But the idea was Turkey, Israel, and India, instead of Pakistan, Iraq, the Gulf, and so on. And this non-Arab axis would assure, continued supplies of oil and geostrategic dominance in this area of the world. And that's what the basis of the war, in my opinion, is about. It's not about the threat of Saddam Hussein. He's a deeply unpopular, horrible dictator whom they supported, bare 15 years ago. Up to the last year or so before the second Gulf War of 1991. So anyway, this is the transformation of policy.
And if there's a war, the people who will suffer, the people who have never had any responsibility, people of Iraq who have never had any responsibility for the rise of Saddam. The US has a responsibility for the rise of Saddam. They're the ones who are going to suffer.
As Ralph Nader said the other day, we know that he has had these things because we have the receipts. It's very important. In the first big report supplied by the Iraqis to Blix in the latter part of last year, of 2002, there was an appendix, which was not published in this country, it was published in Europe, which listed the companies, the mostly American companies, that supplied the Iraqi regime, the Ba'athi regime, with the elements of nuclear and biological and chemical warfare. These were simply deleted from the report, which you remember the State Department said was just a confection of lies and plagiarisms and so on.
Kanti.
I would like your comments about Rushdie's writings' effects on post-colonial
people's characters rather than the influence as literature and entertainment values that we all talk about, but have the people in various countries where the colonialism has finished become somewhat more cognizant and proud and aware of their rights in a different manner than pre-Rushdie?
I don't know if I could answer that, but certainly, it's important to remember that he was one of the great champions of sort of post-colonial people in Britain. In his various essays against, people like Enoch Powell and the racism and discrimination against Indians and West Africans.
And in the Satanic Verses, half of it is not about Islam at all. It's about Thatcherite Britain.
Yeah, exactly, Thatcherite Britain. So Now, I don't know whether many people would recognize themselves, but certainly in the post-colonial world would recognize themselves in novels like Midnight's Children and The Moor's Last Sigh. Because obviously these are fictional characters and are much more imaginative and sort of playful creatures than they are supposed to be portraits of actual people living today. But where I think he's quite spot on in his depictions of say contemporary India is that in a certain way colonialism never ended. I think that's a very important point. That it isn't, as people say, like Naipaul say, well, the white man has left. you know. In fact, the white man doesn't. There's a wonderful scene in Midnight Children, which I remember quite. It's very brilliantly done, and I can't possibly reproduce its wit and humor here. But there's a famous estate in Bombay owned by some English people. Do you remember? They're called the Meckfords or the Methwold, right?
Reach Candy, it's called.
Yeah,
right.
and it's sold to an Indian family by the Methwolds, right?
Right.
But they stipulate that everything that they did,
Yes.
the Indians who bought it have to do also.
Right.
So that includes having martinis and high tea at 5 o'clock. And there's this hilarious scene where he comes back.
My father called them Macaulay's bastards.
Well, exactly. I mean, that there's a kind of slavish imitation of the British, which continues in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, I think, another thing that he does very brilliantly is that he in his literature, he depicts characters who are extremely aware of their own history. I mean, that they understand that their history is a part of their living reality. It is not something in the past. I mean, I think that's the great difference between him and Naipaul, because Naipaul portrays the post-colonial person in a way in novels like Guerrillas, for instance, or in his essays on Eva Peron and Trinidad and so on, that these are people who are just sort of imitators of the white man, and they're to be treated with a great deal of contempt. Whereas Rushdie's characters are self-created. I mean, they are characters who are created out of the self-conscious acceptance of their history, and who look forward to the new with a rather more complex awareness of the past and of the present and of the new conflicts of society, such as that he explores in Shame, between India and Pakistan, between Indians and Hindus, and so on and so forth. So I think, on the whole, his literature, I mean, the characters in his literature as they reflect the characters of the present, I think are much more accurate and much more engaging and much more optimistic, than not. I think. But
Right, sure.
I don't think you agree.
And Kanti, the minor characters in Midnight's Children are the sorts of characters you're sort of wanting us to talk about. The character of Mia Abdullah, for instance, who's really, a sort of low-profile equivalent of the kinds of things that Maulana Azad stood for instance. Muslims who believed in a composite culture, and there's something very touching about Rushdie's sort of understanding of that and sort of smuggling them into the narrative in those ways. The magicians and their sort of social sympathies and so on, which are so removed from, Indira Gandhi and characters like that. But you're absolutely right to raise a question about characters like that, because it's really what makes the novel such an affectionate book on Bombay and India. So, yeah, the back there.
Can either of you tell us if any of Rushdie's work has been translated into either Urdu or Hindi or any of the Indian languages or Arabic?
Yes. There are any number of translations in Hindi and Urdu and Arabic too, I assume. Not Satanic Verses, probably not.
I think Midnight Children was published in Arabic, and yes, Shame was too. And then no, of course not. He wouldn't be published in Arabic.
Well, when he came and spoke here, when you invited him, he was rather annoyed about pirated translations and editions of it available all over the South Asia and Southeast Asia and so on. There was a question. Yeah, the back.
And then I think, sorry, this isn't quite immediately related to the question of translation, but you mustn't forget that in about 2 years ago, he went back to India after the whole fatwa thing and wrote a long piece for the New Yorker about his return to India with his son.
Right.
So he can go to India, and although the filming of Midnight's Children, which was to have been done on British television, I remember him talking to me.
But he won a legal case and got his house.
He got his house, exactly, but they wouldn't allow them to film there. And then they got permission to do it in Sri Lanka, and that was also taken away. I mean, it was felt that, the presence of, for a big project like that, associated with Rushdie in countries with large Muslim populations was still a bit.
Yeah, but Bruce is redeeming all that over here in the Apollo Theater. So
Right.
yeah.
I'm taking us back to Naipaul only because you brought him up a couple of times. And one of the things that occurs to me is this notion that Naipaul, there's a recent article, I think it was in the New Yorker, about Naipaul's whole upbringing in the West Indies and his relationship to class, being Indianness in a society which was black and white, and blackness as the other, and all of these things playing into his portrayal of West Indianness and colonialism. Whereas Rushdie, I think, never went through those kinds of being, as it were, and that would partially probably account for his being far more comfortable with the kind of multiculturalism that he's advocating. What do you think of that? I'm really particularly thinking of this recent essay in the New Yorker.
Which I haven't read.
I'm sorry, and I can't remember who wrote it,
Hilton
but it's
Howes.
very interesting.
Hilton Howes wrote it. I made a note of it, but I haven't read it, in fact. I think you're probably right, but I think it's also a matter of temperament. I think Naipaul's feeling about the world in general. I've only met him once at a Conrad conference many years ago. He's a great, fan of Conrad's. But and of course, one has seen him on television and so on and so forth. But he's a much more, I think, abrasive and how should I put it? He's a much more judgmental writer, I think, than Rushdie is. And his style is much more ascetic. It's a much more pared down and kind of English style in the classical sense of the word than Rushdie's, which is tumultuous and turbulent and full of importations and full of slang and
full of vernacular.
And slang and lots of. They're totally different personalities. So you could say that maybe Naipaul's upbringing was rather more challenging and more, difficult than Rushdie's. But that doesn't explain it, I think, because I think at heart, just the last point, I think at heart Naipaul is much more conservative. And his feelings about modernity are deeply ambivalent, whereas my impression in general of Rushdie's writings are that modernity he's a postmodern novelist, is really full of energy and newness and oldness sort of mixed up together. He doesn't care so much about the proper way of doing things. In fact, most of his novels are really parodies of that. And so that there's a whole difference between the two of them. And as I said, I think Naipaul's feeling about colonialism is much more forgiving and much more tolerant. And he's very, 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 he's very severe with the emanations in the world after. In a novel like Bend in the River, he's merciless about what is today the present-day Congo, really, and very little is said about the depredations of King Leopold's rule, which was horrendous. Millions of people were killed, and that forever distorts the country, as Congo has been. Conrad understood it much better than Naipaul did, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't explain it, but it isn't also entirely true, because Rushdie talks about the terrible time he had at rugby and so on, and with similar sorts of experience, maybe not the same scale.
About a month after September 11th, Rushdie published an editorial in the Times, which I guess you could sort of view as a quasi-position paper for the current Bush administration. I was wondering if you could talk about that in terms of, or maybe in relation to some of his previous writings. I'm thinking more specifically of The Moor's Last Sigh, when he really just viciously lampoons Hindu nationalism and that sort of rise that has a very similar ideology, I guess currently, of a very sort of anti-Islam ideology, and how sort of those conflict or
Yeah, I really can't talk about the paper he wrote in the Times shortly after September 11th. I read it, but I can't remember it. I'm sorry. But I do remember one that came later, in which I think the title, maybe a year after that, in which he writes an essay in the Times, which is called "Islam is the Problem," I think, something like that. And then his view is that, which I think is true, I agree with it, that in large areas of the Islamic world, Islam has been captured by, the worst elements of dogmatism and fanaticism and, kind of an absence of tolerance and so on and so forth. But I don't disagree with that, but again, as I said earlier, I don't think he pays enough attention to the varieties of Islam. It's a much more monolithic view of it than I would volunteer. That's number one. And number two, it's quite invidious because he doesn't talk about the other monotheistic fundamentalists and crazies that populate this world. Not all of them are Muslim. There are Christian fundamentalists, one of whom is our president. I'm really quite serious about this. These are people who are at least, people who don't believe in evolution, for example. There's a lot made about the schools in places like Saudi Arabia and the madrasas, as they call them, in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which are deplorable. There are places in this country where you still can't teach, where it's a legal issue as to whether you can teach Darwinism. You can't teach evolution.
It's not surprising.
And creationism has a very strong constituency. And the same, I'm sorry, just one last point. And the same is true of Judaism. There's a lot of fanaticism in Judaism today. And the people who go around killing Palestinians on the West Bank, I've had experiences of this where I've seen Israeli soldiers and settlers taking over Palestinian lands and bulldozing the farm, just wiping out the work of families who live off the land. And when I asked them about this is not their land, he told me, the Israeli soldier, in 1998. I said, whose land is it? He said, it's the land of the people of Israel. Well, so what about that? I think the phenomenon, the monotheistic, and I suppose the Hindu nationalists too, all of this kind of fundamentalism, in my opinion, has to be treated together. That these are sick creeds that feed off each other, but to single out one and say, the problems are all there is I think, terrible. I think one really has to be, and that's where I feel, Salman hasn't really been forceful enough in talking about this, that all of these religious, the politics of religion, and especially of religious fanaticism, are really dependent on each other and really have to be dealt with and opposed together. Not you say, well, we want to oppose this and not that.
I couldn't resist saying that it's not surprising that Bush doesn't believe in evolution. He's a living instance of its falsity. But I just wanted to say one thing. You're absolutely right to point out that the Moore's Last Sigh is tremendously critical of Hindu fundamentalism. So there's a sense in which he is a little even-handed when it comes to that. But
no, I was just talking about his writing after 9/11.
In the nonfiction.
In the nonfiction, yes.
But really it does seem to me that it's not as if he is not seeing, he's against religious fanaticism of any kind. But what he needs to focus on is the kind of Muslim who is going to possibly believe what he's saying. And that kind of Muslim is not going to believe what he's saying if he or she is constantly having to fight off wars, talk about how they don't believe in modernity and freedom and so on and so forth, right? And he's playing into that by supporting this war and so on. So it's not as if he's not even-handed, he's confused about what his own targets are and how to hit them or approach them.
I think there's just one more point about this. I think in my opinion, there's a greater disconnect or disparity between his prose, non-fictional prose, and his fiction now than there was during the period of the decade of the 80s, which produced Midnight Children and Shame and the Jaguar Smile. And now I think he's caught up in a world of much greater media magnification. And of course he's become a great celebrity. There's no question he's probably the most famous writer in the world. And he went through a harrowing experience during the years he was in hiding and sought out to be killed, during those 4 or 5 years when he was underground. And, persecuted and unable to travel really. I remember when he came here, actually, in 1998 or 1999, he told me that British Airways would still not take him on a plane. I mean, he had to come on some other airline. I mean, coming from London, that would, one of the logical things would be to take British Airways, but they still wouldn't take him.
Iran Air, I think.
But he had to come on another air. So that kind of thing, I think, in the end, changes and perhaps confuses, as you say, the individual.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've spoken about the writers who he influenced. How would you say that he continued the
Tradition set forth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez of magical realism and national allegory.
How does he what? Oh, I'm sorry. What was the?
You've spoken about who he influenced with his writing. How would you say that he reacted to his influences? People have shown parallels between Midnight's Children and 100 Years of Solitude and things like that.
Good to grasp.
Yeah. He's written about us in the people who influenced him. I mean, Kafka, I think, is one. Nabokov is another. Calvino is another. Marquez, you mentioned. But for example, there's a great deal of appreciation in him for writers who are more conventional than he is, but who treat similar themes of displacement and discrimination. Nadine Gordimer, he wrote a very appreciative essay about her, a collection of her short stories that I recall quite well. And in general, he seems to be very interested in novelists who are like him. Migratory, who are, like the South African writers in exile during that period. Kundera, an East European writer, also in exile living in Paris. I mean, transplanted, expatriate, and so on. I mean, those are the people who mean a great deal to him. And I have to say it, I mean, it's because it was very flattering to me. He wrote very well about some of my work, and it made a great difference to me that he did. About, for example, my book on After the Last Sky, which he and I did a dialogue about at the ICA in London, which is published also in Imaginary Homelands. And then in his latest book, whose name I can't remember, collection also of essays published by Random House, there's a very terrific essay by him on my book of memoirs after Out of Place. So I think he has a very sharp eye for people that he can identify with in the modern world, and they are, in many ways, share a similar fate, perhaps, which is that of being not at home, but abroad.
Yeah.
What's the time? I'm very tired.
Dr. Said, as someone who studied Islam for many, many years, I was hoping you could enlighten sort of Muslims that are in this room as well as elsewhere about these two questions that I have. The first is, what do you see as the sort of the future of Islam in the West in a post 9/11 environment when we see Islam being polarized in very two opposite ways, especially here in the West? And the second question was, how can Muslims create and proliferate a progressive and pluralist vision of Islam that respects basic human rights and a culture of democracy in the Muslim world?
Well, it's not going to be done by America, I can tell you that. My view is, first of all, I'm not an expert on Islam. I mean, that's a kind of ridiculous oversimplification. And I don't, myself have any particularly expert knowledge of it as such. But what has always impressed me is that it seems to me much more diverse and much more complex in its manifestations than similar. I mean, so I find it very difficult to talk about the world of Islam, which is what often comes up and I'm much happier with political and historical experiences that have occurred to Muslims in countries that have large Muslim populations or majorities. And I think it's also true to say that, words that have become highly demagogic, like, well, leaving aside the main one, which is terrorism, for which no one has found an answer, except that it's always associated with Islam. But, I mean, most of the discussions that take place today about the word terrorism, I mean, there was a big debate in the United Nations during the 70s trying to define terrorism, and they failed. They just were unable to do it. Nobody could agree on it. One of the reasons being is that terrorism is always associated now with non-state apparatuses, you know, individual groups like Bin Laden, Qaeda, etc. And I think there's a very important component of state terrorism, which is simply never talked about, that states perform acts of terrorism. I mean, the modern world, I mean, look at Germany. You could describe all of that as state terrorism in the Nazi period. In any event, what I wanted to say was the vocabulary of describing Muslims and talking about moderates and modern and modernizing, you know, the kind of rubbish that somebody like Thomas Friedman trades in. You know, they have to reform, and you know, I just find it inconceivable that anybody can talk about as vast a phenomenon as this with as little knowledge. First of all, before you can talk about the whole world of Islam in these general ways, you have to know the languages, and he's never demonstrated, people like him, I mean, have never demonstrated that they have any knowledge of what takes place, I mean, immediate knowledge of what takes place in universities and so on, and schools all over the Islamic world. And second, and most important, who says that the modernizing trend is set by the West? I mean, because that would include having to pass through the experience of genocide, you know, which is not one of the happier experiments or results of modernization. I mean, modernization is not an adequate yardstick. There was that wonderful exchange between Muhammad Ali, the boxer, Ali as they call him here, and somebody down at the World Trade Center after 9/11, where he said, the guy said to Muhammad Ali, he said, "How does it feel to the religion that did this?" And he said, "How does it feel to be a member of the religion that brought us Hitler?" I mean, so you could play that game, you know, and come out with absolutely ridiculous results. But what I'm trying to say is, in fact, that if you take off all of these labels and these phony counters like democracy and modernization and so on and so forth, you'll find that there is dynamism and change taking place everywhere. And that I've written about this. And I think one ought to be able to regard cultures as going through a period of trying to define themselves. I mean, I think that's really the major phenomenon of the present period that we're passing through, whether in Islam or in the West or elsewhere, that there's been such a seismic change, not because of the end of the Cold War, although that's important enough, and not because of the nuclear and the technological revolutions and all of that stuff, but because of immigration, but because of the vast movements of populations, that the nature of a national identity has changed so much that all of these countries, like Germany, like Pakistan, which is a relatively new country, like Israel, like America, are going through processes of self-definitions which are not over yet, and which are beginning to redefine the terms of how we think about the past, how we think about the present, how we study history, what history do we study. Every major culture, every major society and minor society on earth is going through that period now. And I think that's the way to look at it, and not to use the invidious terms and say, well, they're backward and they are really pre-modern and they haven't quite achieved this, and we are going to, in the manner of Rumsfeld and the others, well, we're going to bring democracy there. You don't import these things from the outside, or if you do, you cause a lot of damage, I think.
Thanks a lot, Edward. Edward Said.